Hello and welcome to part 2 of module 7 in our Angular series. As mentioned to you in the last session, we're going to be discussing Angular forms. Let's begin with the question, why do we need forms? And we may need forms to allow for a user to log in maybe, right? To allow for users to update their profiles, maybe enter sensitive information like credit card information, or enter shipping information, which is going to be the case for our project, right? Now let's look at the fundamental building blocks that Angular provides in terms of forms. We have the form control, we have the form group, and we also have something called the form array, which we look at later. Coming to the form control, you may have filled in forms for job applications or college admissions or bank account opening. In each of those forms, you may have had to fill in first name, last name, email ID, telephone number, etc. Each of those fields that you fill in Angular terms would be considered a form control, right? And the form control would allow us to track the value and validation of an individual form control, right? So, for example, if you have a first name form control, that would allow us to track the value and validation of first name. Similarly, an email ID form control would allow us to track the value and validation of email ID. Here's an example, const name equal to new form control, right? So what we're doing here is we're instantiating um, or we are creating an instance of the form control class and putting that into the constant name. Okay, we could initialize this form control value to something, or we could just leave it as an empty set of quotes. We also have the form group, and the form group allows us to track the value and validation of a group of form controls. So here's an example. We could say shipping form equal to new form group. So here we are instantiating the form group and then putting in the form controls that we want to be part of that form group. So for example, we could have first name as a form control. We could have last name as another form control. We could have address as a form group. So now we can see that we could have a form group nested within another form group. And why would we do that? Because we could have controls like street, city, state, zip that are related to address directly. The two braces here would complete the definition of the address form group, and then the other two would complete the definition of the shipping form group, right? Continuing with our discussion on form groups, we've seen that the form group allows for us to track value and validity state of a group of form control instances. The form group would aggregate the values of each child form control into an object. What does that mean? The form group basically would be an object with the properties as the controls, right? So as is mentioned here, the child controls with the key, which would be the name under which the control is registered, would be the property, okay, of the object. And how we could refer to that is something like this: shipping form dot first name, shipping form dot address dot street, right? Because street is part of the address form group, which in turn is part of the shipping form group. Then we could have methods, add control, which would allow us to add a form control to the form group. Remove control would allow us to remove a control from the form group. Set control would allow us to replace a form control in the form group or change the name of the form control in the form group. Contains would allow us to check if a form control is part of the form group. Set value would allow us to change the values of all form controls in the form group, and patch value could be used to change the value of just a few of the form controls in the form group. Reset would allow us to initialize or reinitialize the values of all form controls to null. Okay. The next building block is the form array. And the form array, by its very name, suggests that it would allow us to track the value and validity state of an array or a collection of form control instances. Right? The values of each child form control in the form array would be aggregated into an array. And because this is an array, we could use properties like length. The controls could also be used as properties just as in form group. The methods we could use are at, so we could access a particular form control at a particular index in the form array. We could append a form control to the form array. We could insert a form control at a particular index or position in the form array. We could remove a control at a particular index in the form array. Again, we could replace or change the name of a form control in the form array, and set value and patch value work the same as in form group, right? So again, set value would allow us to change the value of all form controls in the form array, and patch value would allow us to change the values of a few of the form controls in the form array. Now let's look at the types of forms. We've got reactive forms and template-driven forms that Angular provides. And some of the differences are, as you can see here, we have a view file and the class file, right? And of course, those are part of the component. And that's, of course, the same for template-driven forms. But the way template-driven forms and reactive forms work is different. So in the case of reactive forms, we would define the form model in the class file. What is the form model? It could be one form control, it could be a form group, it could be a form array. Okay, that would be our form model. We would then, with each element in our view file, put in the form control directive just like this, which would then link each of those elements to a particular form control in the form model, right? So in this case, we are saying favorite food, for example, is the name of the element. Using the form control directive along with that element would link it to a particular form control in the form model. And we will understand this better when we actually go into code. For now, just remember that the form model is defined in the class file, and we allow for data flow between the view and the class file through this form control directive. Okay, so there is direct access um, between each element and its specific form control in the class file. Coming to the template-driven forms, everything is driven by the template as the name suggests. So here we cannot define the form model in the class file, right? Rather, what we do is we use the ng model directive in the view file or on the template along with each element, right? And that becomes the form model. So every element that has an ng model directive associated with it will be part of the form model. Okay, and in order to have communication between the form model and the view file, we use ng model, the directive, along with two-way data binding. Okay. Again, the communication between the class file and the view file would be through the ng model directive as well. We could also use ng model on its own. which would indicate that we don't want to capture or save the data from those form elements, although they may be part of the form model. Okay, and we look at that more closely when we actually go into the code. Right, coming to how a class file looks for each of these forms. In case of the template-driven form, we just define the properties, right? And in case of reactive forms, though, we need to import the form control class and validators from Angular forms. And once we do that, we can then define the form model, right? So here the form model is just one form control, as you can see. We've instantiated the form control class, and we are also using the built-in validators. So we have here a built-in validator required, which specifies that this particular form field cannot be left blank. And then we have minimum length, which means that the user has to enter at least 5 characters, okay, in order for this field to be valid. Coming to the view files for each of these forms, you can see as is highlighted here that validations need to be specified on the template, and we are also using ng model, the directive with two-way binding, right? And that's of course linked to the property that we defined in our class file. Here we have now what is called a template reference variable. So when you see this hashtag, right, this means that this is a template reference variable. And as you can see, we are exporting ng model to that template reference variable. Once we do that, we can use that variable for validation. So here we're saying if wayfood.invalid. Now we can use this property because that comes from ng model. Okay, so immediately that means that if it is invalid and dirty or touched. Now what does this mean? Dirty means that the user has started typing in something into the field and backspaced on it. Okay, so that's dirty. Touched would mean the user has positioned the cursor and then moved away, not really typed in anything. So that's touched. Why are we using dirty or touched along with invalid? Because we could use just, the check for this element value being invalid. But then, if you think about it, when the form loaded for the first time, right, the fields would be invalid because nothing has been entered. And then we would have messages unnecessarily displayed to the user, right? So to avoid that, we have messages displayed only if the template reference variable fulfills these conditions. So either dirty or touched and invalid, right? Then we will check if the error is in terms of the required validation. Then we have a certain message displayed to the user. If it is in terms of minimum length, then we have another message displayed to the user. You know how the ngIf works, right? If on the other hand it is valid, right, then we give the user a different message. And of course, these classes are styling classes that we could use in our CSS file. Okay, so that's about the template-driven form view file. In terms of the reactive form view file, as you can see here, we use the form control directive. Right? Once we use this form control directive, the form control we define as part of the form model is now linked to this element, right? And then we say if, and of course the name has to be the same. Yeah, we cannot change the name. And then of course we're using ngIf to check for invalid and again dirty or touched, in which case we have a styling class there and we check for which validation has not been met. I hope this is clear. Now coming to the styling classes, right? We saw alert danger, we saw alert success. So you could have something like this, right? There are built-in classes that Angular provides that we could use to visually indicate to the user if what they entered is valid, if it is invalid, right? And here we specify not form. Why? Because we don't want this particular color to appear if the form is invalid. Because if I didn't put this in, for example, then the form would have a border of 5 pixels in this color if it is invalid. So if you don't want the form to have that border, then you just specify not form. We could have a styling for touched as well. So if the user positioned the cursor, didn't type in anything, then there would be a certain color that would appear, right? Okay, coming to all the styling classes that we could use, ng untouched, right? That means this particular class would apply when the form is first loaded. Ng touched we know, ng dirty we know, ng invalid we know, ng valid of course is obvious, and then ng pristine. Okay, so pristine would mean that we have not touched the form again. So it's very similar to untouched. Okay, now let's now go and create a project. What we're going to do is we're going to create a project and we're going to use template driven forms in that project. So this is separate from our current project. It's just a form project. Okay, and then we will go to our main project and we'll create a reactive form there. So you have the experience of both. Right, so what you need to do is you need to go to the Node.js command prompt, right? And I have already created a form. So you will be in your user folder, right? And then you will say here ng new and you give a project name. Okay, so form project or something like that, or template driven form project, something. Okay, I'll leave the name up to you. Go through the process of creating the project. You know, Angular will ask you what styling file you need. We're using CSS, press enter, right? Go through the whole thing. Once the project is created, then come straight to the app component HTML file. Okay, so we'll come straight here. You'll have to delete everything that is there in the app component HTML file, and then we can start putting in our template. So we'll first start with a div. Okay, just a simple div. We will then put in just a heading that says employees data. We will then proceed to put in the form tag, and you can see here again we're using this template reference variable and we are exporting ng form directive into that. This will allow us to check if the form itself is valid. Okay, we're using the ng if directive equal to not submitted. Now obviously you may have figured out that this is going to be a Boolean type, and if submitted is false, then we want this form to appear. What it means is if the user has submitted the data, then we don't want that form to appear. We don't want a blank form again to appear, right? ng submit we'll come to later. No validate means we don't want the default browser validation to be implemented. Okay. Once we put that in, next thing is we put in a div class equal to form group. Then we put in a label. So this is exactly what will appear on screen. That's exactly what label is for. Okay. And now we need the user to put in the name. So we use the input tag type equal to text. So the input tag can have different types, right? We're looking just now at type equal to text because name is going to be a text element or in text format. We're using the required validation here, and you can see the template reference variable into which we are exporting ng model. The name attribute has to be used when we create template driven forms in Angular, or we will get an error. And then we have the ng model directive with two-way binding. Now just put this in as is. I will explain to you what we are doing here. Okay. Now you can see we are using something different here. We are not using what we saw on the slide. And that's because we are using Bootstrap. I'm going to introduce you to Bootstrap. With Bootstrap, we get classes or styling classes automatically. We don't have to put anything into the CSS file. So in your browser, what you can do is just type in Bootstrap 4.5. See this introduction. When you click on that, this is what you'll get, right? Click on copy. So you'll have to scroll down a bit if you see in this page. Right, this is what you'll see. Just scroll down till you see CSS. Just click copy and then come back to your project. And in your index.html file, just paste that in. Okay, it should be above this closing head tag. Right, just paste that in. Once that is done, you can then use Bootstrap. Right, so these classes are coming from Bootstrap. Right, so class dot is invalid equal to emp name dot invalid and emp name dot touched. Okay. Then what we'll do is we're putting here the small tag class equal to text changer. Now this is again coming from Bootstrap. So we don't have to really define the styling. Class dot d none again is Bootstrap. This is display none. So if what the user has entered is valid or untouched, remember untouched will be the case when the form is first loaded. So if it is valid or untouched, then we don't want this message to be displayed. Okay, so this message will be displayed if it is invalid and touched. Okay. Then the next thing we'll do is we'll have the next group, which is address. Okay, and within that we'll have a div class equal to form group. Now you can use ng model group equal to address if you want a particular form group to be validated separately from the rest of your form. So just put it in there to show you, right? And then we'll have our first field or form element, which is street. And then of course the input tag type equal to text, class equal to form control. Now again, we don't need to put in styling. This is going to come directly from Bootstrap. Name equal to street. We need the name attribute as I said earlier. And here we are using ng model on its own. As you can see here, we are using two-way binding. Here we are not, right? Because this data we want to capture and save, right? And I'll come to what emp model is, as I said, later on, right? For now, just remember that this particular field or form element, we do not want to save the data for. In that case, we use ng model on its own. The next thing we'll do is we'll create another div, and again class equal to form group, and we'll have city there, and the input type is text, and again this one we don't want data captured for. Next one is another div, class equal to form group. We have state, and again we don't want to capture the data for state. You have zip code next, right? And then a div, input type is again text, and again we don't want to capture the data for zip code. Now we have another div, right? Again class equal to form group. We have phone number, and then the input type equal to tell, right? So we have seen with the input tag the type equal to text. Now we have type equal to tell for telephone, and we have a pattern attribute here. So here we are specifying what exactly the phone number should contain. So here we are saying that the phone number should be 10 digits. Okay, the D specifying digits. And then before that, we don't want anything. And after those 10 digits, nothing. So the dollar signifies after that nothing, and the exponentiation sign here. Okay. We are using to specify that we don't want anything before this. Template reference variable equal to ng model, and here we have two-way binding, right? So we want the data for the phone number captured. Okay, so emp model.phone. Then we will have a div, right? In which we're checking if there are errors and phone is invalid or touched, right? Then we're checking for, or rather we're going to say check if there is an error with required. That means the user has not entered anything, and we'll give him the message phone number required. We will next check for if there's an error in the pattern, and then we'll give him a message, or him or her a message rather, saying phone number must be 10 digits. Okay. After that, we'll have another div. Okay. And this form group or this div would be with regard to email ID. So a label for that. And then an input tag. Type now is email. Okay. So we've looked at type text, type tell, and now type email. Again, a template reference variable into which we are exporting ng model. Required is the validation we need, right? The pattern that we need for this validation. Now the pattern specifies A to Z, 0 to 9, A percentage sign can be included as well, a dot, an underscore, a plus, a minus. Okay, now maybe you don't want all these characters and you can delete those. Then we need an at the rate sign. So plus, at the rate, and then the pattern again that we want. Remember, our email ID is something at something dot something, right? That's normally the format. So at the rate something, which is A to Z 0 to 9 dot and dash or hyphen plus the dot and then A to Z only, which can be between 2 and 4 characters long. After that, nothing, right? And then, of course, we have ng model with two-way binding equal to mmodel.email. Again, like I said, I'll come to what mmodel is shortly. Just put that in for now. So that completes email ID. The next one we need is, or the next thing we need to do is to check for errors. So if email.errors and email.invalid or touched, right, then we check for if there is errors with required, meaning the user has not entered anything. Then the message will go saying email is required, right? The next thing we'll do is check for if there are errors in the pattern. Then we'll have the message displayed. Email can contain letters, numbers, underscores only. Then we will have another div, okay, and within that div we'll have a select tag. Now the select tag is used when we want to have a kind of a drop down list, okay, and here we are using the blur event. So if the user positions the cursor, right, and then moves away, that's when the blur event is emitted. And when the blur event is emitted, we have this function being executed taking the value of this field, form field or form element. Okay. Again, we have this same function executed if there is a change event. So if the user changes the value, okay, or as the user is changing the value, right? So we have that executed again, taking the value that has been changed. Then we have a template reference variable again into which we're exporting ng model. And there's two-way binding going on here, right? So this data we want to capture as well. We're using the bootstrap class here, right? So if it is invalid, or rather if there is an error and m-typed or touched, you know what touched means now, then we will have this particular styling class. Then we're using class custom select, which is again a bootstrap class, name equal to m-type. Okay, custom select meaning we will have the drop-down list in a particular um, design, if I could put it that way. Then we have the option tag, which goes hand in hand with the select tag. And with the option tag, we will specify our options, right, for the drop-down list. So the first one is with the value default, and this is what will be displayed. Employee is, and then we have another option in which we are putting an ng4. Okay, so with this ng4 directive, this will show us all the options, right? So of course we have to define the options, which we'll do in our class file, right? So I hope the select an option tag is clear. The next thing we'll do is we will now check for errors. Okay, so again, we are using the bootstrap styling class here, which is display none. If this Boolean type is false, meaning there's no error in terms of what the user has selected, or it is untouched. Okay. Otherwise, if there is an error or it is touched, then we will have this message displayed. Okay. Then there's another div, and within that div, we'll have a label gender, and within that another div, and here we are using input type equal to radio. What's a radio button? Those little round buttons that you see, which you can select one of those, right? You must have used these already. So that's what a radio button is. Name attribute is gender. This is the default value that will be selected. And then we're using two-way binding again because we want to capture this data. Okay? And then we have the label male, right? We have another div, and within that we have the value female. So again, this is a radio button. The name attribute is the same, and of course we want to capture the data, so we're using ng model with two-way binding, right? That's the label that will appear, or rather what will appear on screen. Okay. Then we have one more div, and here we have the gender for others. Okay, so that's three options or three radio buttons for gender. Okay, that is of course what will appear on screen. Finally, we have a button which will be disabled, right, if the form is invalid or emp type has error is true. Okay. So basically this button will not allow for clicking if the form is invalid or emp type has error. And again, we're using bootstrap styling classes here. Now we see a type of button which says submit. So this is a special type of button. This is of course HTML, right? And when we have a button with type submit, what will happen is when this button is clicked, the ng submit event will be emitted. And when the ng submit event is emitted, we can do something. In our case, we're going to be executing the onSubmit function or the onSubmit method, right? Okay. And that completes our form in terms of the HTML. Now you could go through this again after the session, and if there's anything you don't understand, please, feel free to pose a question in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Now coming to the CSS file, you'll see that that is empty. We don't put in anything there because we're using Bootstrap. Come now to the class file. And we'll start by importing employee. Now, of course, you're going to get a squiggly there because we haven't defined employee. Okay, so what you do is in your app directory, right click, okay, click new file, type in emp model.ts. You can see I have created it already and therefore I'm getting this message. Once that file is created, we are going to create this class of our own called employee, and that's what emp model was about, which you saw in the HTML file. Every class needs a constructor in which we're going to specify the properties in this case because we want it to be an object when it is instantiated. Okay, so public ID, public emp name, phone, email, emp type, and gender. Okay. Once you do that, when you come back to your class file, you shouldn't have that squiggly. Okay. We will then proceed to create a service. You can see here there's a constructor with emp induction service. We need to create that service. So you can choose to go back to your Node.js command prompt, right? And then type in ng from within the project, of course. So cd form proj, that is the case for me. Okay, I spelled that wrong. And then ng generate service. And the name of the service will be emp induction. Okay, as you can see, I have it here. So just type in there emp induction. Okay. Once the service is created, of course, press enter to do that. Once the service is created, come to that service file and we will start here. We continue with the class later. We start here by importing employee again, which is the class we created. And then we'll have to import HTTP client, as you can see from the constructor here, right? Injected that into the constructor. So you can do that now. You will have a squiggly though, which is okay. Right? We'll then import HTTP client and HTTP error response. Now, in order to do this, you know that in your app module file, so if you come to your app module file, you will need to import HTTP client module. While you're at it, also import the forms module, which we need in order to use template-driven forms. If you're using reactive forms, we would import the reactive forms module. So put in HTTP client module and the forms module. Okay. Don't worry if you don't have app routing module, we don't need it. Also make sure to add HTTP client module and forms module to the imports array. So comma after if you have app routing module, otherwise after browser module, put in HTTP client module and forms module. Okay, so now the app module file is set up for this project in terms of the HTTP client module as well as the forms module. Right, come back to your induction service And then the next thing we'll do is we'll import catch error from RxJS operators and throw error from RxJS. Once that is done, we can then proceed to put in this property. Now here what we're going to do is we're going to be learning about the post method as well today. And for the post method, okay, which allows us to write to a file, we're going to be using the post method today, which will allow us to write to the file. Okay, so what we are doing here is we are going to be creating a kind of a fake server, you can call it. Okay, but we're going to be using Node.js again. So just put this in for now. Okay, we're going to be using that port and /inducted. I'll come to what this is later. Okay, just put that in. Right, so that's just a property for now with a string attached to it. Next thing we'll do is we'll define a function which is going to take in a parameter, and you can see it is of employee type, that is based on the class we just defined, right? And then we have a return statement, and this is where we're using the post method. We used the get method the last time to read from the file. The post method will allow us to write to the file. So this.http, again HTTP, remember, is injected into the constructor .post. Okay, and that's of any type. Okay, so it's going to return of any type. Then we are going to specify where we want to write this this data that is coming in. We want to write it to this particular address, and I'll come to again what inducted is shortly. So just specify this.emp URL, comma, and the name of the parameter. So again, we're using the post method to write to a file. We'll then use the pipe method, or what is called the pipe operator, okay, which again comes from RxJS. And the pipe operator, in this case, don't mix it up with the Angular pipe that we use in our view files. This one is used in order to combine functions. Okay, so we are combining this with the post method. Basically, we are combining the catch error method and the post method, and within that catch error method, we are calling another function which we'll come to soon enough. So just put in that pipe method there. We'll then define our error handler method, which is going to take a parameter. You can name this whatever you want, but it has to be of HTTP error response type. Okay, and then return, throw error, and that's all. Right, so this finishes our service. I'll come to what is inducted later. Let's complete our class file. Right, so again, we've now created the service. Right, we then import it. And then you're now defining emp types. Remember that we're using this in our select tag. right? So if you come to your view file, you will see that we're using it here, right? Especially when we are iterating over M types. Okay, so come back to your class file, put those in. We can have employees either temporary or on contract or permanent. We'll then proceed to define our M type has error, which is a Boolean type. Another property error message. Submitted. Remember, we need submitted because we're using it in our view file, right? For if only if submitted is false, we want the form displayed. Okay. We'll then define emp model here, okay, which is new employee. Now this property is different from the file, yeah, don't mix it up. Okay, this is just a property now, right, that we're using in our view file. And what we're doing here is we're creating an instance of that class, right? If you saw, this is the name of our class, right? So we are creating an instance of that class, and we have to put in all values. So we have the ID. What do we have next? We have the name. We have the phone number, email ID, right? And then remember, with the select tag in our view file, we are specifying here default, right? So we are using that here, okay, and that of course is for gender. So as you can see, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 should match the number of properties we have here, and of course their types as well, right? Now why are we doing this? Okay, let's go further in our class file. We're going to have a function validate emp type, and this of course has nothing to do with emp model. Of course we'll create this first. This is the validate emp type that is coming to or being called rather from our view file here. So when the blur event is emitted and when the change event is emitted, right? In that, we're just checking if that parameter coming through is equal to default, right? If it is still equal to default, then has error is true, because we can't have default there. We need the employee to be of a certain type, either temporary, contract, or permanent. Okay, so default will happen if the user moves away. As I said, the blur event occurs or is emitted when the user positions a cursor and then moves away from that form field. Otherwise, this .m type has error equal to false, right? Then we will now define the onSubmit method, which remember will be executed, as I said earlier, when the user clicks on this button and the ng submit event is emitted. So again, just to reinforce, when the user clicks on the button, the ng submit event is emitted because we have the button as type equal to submit, remember? So the ng submit event is emitted, and when the ng submit event is emitted, that's when we will execute this function. So now what we're going to put into that function is just a console.log. That's just for debugging purpose. You can ignore that if you don't want to put it in. This dot submitted equal to true, right? We need to put in this statement because we don't want the form to be displayed again once the data has been submitted. Remember, in our view file, we're specifying only if submitted is false, we want the form displayed, right? We are then calling the induct employee method from the service file and passing this property as a parameter. Okay, right? And remember that in our HTML file or the view file, we've got ng model with two-way binding to ensure that we have data flowing to emp name, for example, right? As well as emp.phone and emp.email, right? And then emp.model .mtype, right? So that data will be sent then to this method or to this function. Now we're using the subscribe method. Why? Because you come back to your service file, the post method, okay, returns an observable, just like the get method, and therefore we can subscribe to it. Okay, so we're subscribing to that observable, and all we are doing within the subscribe method is we're taking the data that is being returned and logging it, just logging a message on the screen along with the data. Okay, if there's an error, we're taking that error and assigning it to error message, which of course is a property we have defined here. And that completes our class file definition. Now coming to inducted that we saw here. Now what is that exactly? So come to Notepad. You don't need to put this data in at all. So I'm going to delete that. You don't need to put that in. All you need to put in is this curly brace and then put in the word inducted. Okay. That's going to refer to our object array, right? And then, of course, this is for our object, which actually we don't need. Put in the closing array and the closing brace. I'm going to remove this, right? So this is all you need. The opening curly brace, inducted colon, array, and close that. So this is an object array. And now you know why we use the word inducted there. right? Now save this file within your project folder. Just going to show you how. So we'll go to our C drive, the users, username, come to the project, so mine is form proj, okay. Don't select text file, select all files, right? Put in employee.json, then save it, okay. That's all. And now we need to actually create that fake server, right? So for that, come back to your Node.js command prompt, okay, and you need to type in a command. So the command is npm install -g json-server. That's all. Press enter and that should install the JSON server. Once the server is installed, all you need to do is, I'm just going to type it in, json-server -watch. And what's the name of our file? employee.json. Okay, press enter. And remember, this is in another, so this is in one instance of Node.js. Okay, just start that server. You can simultaneously start another instance of Node.js. Okay, just by typing in Node.js and clicking open, you'll have another instance. And within that instance, you can then compile the project. Okay, we have some errors here. It should be okay, I believe. I'm just going to compile it again and see if we have errors. So now we have two instances of Node.js running, one compiling the project and one which is running the JSON server. Okay, so the compilation seems to be done now. Right, let's go and run our project. So here we have a form. I just reduce this a bit. So now you can enter name. Okay, now you can see you get these annoying kind of prompts. If you don't want those, then what you need to do is you need to put in here in your view file, and I'll do it for one, then you can do it for the rest. Right, let me do it for name. So here we can see auto complete. So now if I just type in, as you see, I don't get those prompts. So again, what you need to do is just use the autocomplete attribute, and again what you write inside these quotes is of no consequence. Okay, just write something in there and then that will disallow these prompts. So again, I can put in the name. If I don't put it in, you can see I get the error message. Okay. Similarly for street, now because I don't have that, I'm getting the prompts. Yeah, so let's just put in some name here. And again, city, state, zip code. Now if you move away, you don't get an error because we haven't put in an error there. Okay, we haven't checked for, if you see here, we have not checked. Because basically we're not saving this data. We don't want this data to be saved in our file. Okay, so you can put in anything there. And phone number, it requires 10 characters. So see that I put in 10 digits. Now for the email, to check if our verification works. So you can see now I'm getting the message. Right, now if I put in a character that is not allowed, again I get the message. But if I put a character that is within those, right, you can see that disappears because we've included percentage. Now normally you wouldn't have percentage in an email ID, but I just put it in there, to show that that's what happens when you build that pattern. And that, by the way, is called a regular expression. You will hear the short term regex used very often. Okay. Now we have employees, and you can see the design because of Bootstrap, right? So you can see the styling is this way. You can select what is now. If you leave it, right, and you just select, you will get an error message, right? So need to select that, select the gender, and now submit form is enabled. If, for example, you had left this as employees, you can see this is disabled, right? So you need to select that. Okay. Now when we click submit form, remember when we click submit, the ng submit event is emitted. That will lead to the on submit method being executed, where we are using the post method, right? And now you can see we get a message successfully inducted and the name. You can also see that the ID is automatically changed to 1. We did not do that, right? This is automatically done. So this is how the JSON server works. This is how template-driven forms work. Now that we're done with creating a template-driven form, right, as well as using the post method, we can now do the similar thing in our main project. We'll, however, create a reactive form. But to do that, we need to first of all create a component. So you can stop the server on one of your Node.js command prompts, Control C. Then change directory to your main project directory, right? And you can do that by just typing in cd dot dot like that, and then cd space and the name of your project. You can load the project first, or you can choose to generate the component. To generate the component, ngg c shipping. Okay, we're generating this new component for the purpose of the form. Once the component is created, like I said, you can load your project. Just type in code space dot, and that should load your project. Right? Once the project is loaded, comes to the app routing module file. Okay. And in the app routing module file, import shipping component. And of course, we need to add a path for that component. So path shipping and the name of the component. Okay, once that is done, let's now proceed to create the form. Let's come to the HTML file and we'll start by putting in just a div. Okay, within that div, we will have the heading, right? Enter shipping details, and then we'll put in the form tag. And you can see we're using the form group directive here. In template driven forms, we use the ng form directive. We have the ng if directive. Again, if submitted is false, then only will this form be displayed. Right? And of course, we have the ng submit event, right? Which basically has the function on submit executing when this event is emitted. Okay. Within the form tag, we'll put in a div for a form control. Then we'll have a break tag after that. And within the div, we'll have a label, first name. So this is basically the form control for the first name, right? But remember, of course, we will be defining the form model in our class file. Okay. So once we put in the label, we then put in input type, and we're using the form control name directive here to specify that first name is going to be a form control in our class file. Using autocomplete again to avoid those annoying browser prompts, right? Then we have a div to check for validation. So if first name dot invalid and first name dot dirty or first name dot touched, you know what those mean now. Remember, dirty is if the user has placed their cursor, his or her cursor, I should say, in the appropriate position, but has typed in something and then backspaced on it, right? Then that's considered dirty. If on the other hand, the user placed the cursor in position but then moved away from that field or that form element, then that's touched. Okay. So if it is dirty or touched, then we are checking for errors, right? So if errors not required, meaning it is left blank, then we say first name is required. Otherwise, we check for if there are errors in minimum length, right? If the user has typed some part of the first name and then left it, right? Because we have a minimum length validator here that we will put into the form model. Okay, so first name must be at least 3 characters long. You can change that if you like, right? You can make it 2, or you can, remove this validation altogether if you don't want it, right? After that, we will see if the user has entered something valid. So if it is valid in terms of the validations that we have provided, then we put in the message validated. The next thing we'll do is we'll have the next form control and a break tag after that. Within the div, we have the label for last name. We have the input, again type equal to text, form control name again equal to last name. And the control we define in the form model needs to have the same spelling, right? Along with camel case like we've used here. Okay. Then we have, of course, a div, again checking for errors, just as we did for first name. And within that, we check for if last name dot errors question mark dot require. Don't forget the question mark or you will have compiler errors. For this form, although we are specifying styling classes, we are not using Bootstrap. We are going to be defining these classes in our CSS file. So you have a taste of both Bootstrap as well as the form with CSS defined as we're going to do here. That's the message that will be displayed if the user leaves the last name blank. Okay. Then we check for minimum length and we have another message displayed. After that, we have now a custom validator and we'll see how to build this. So if what the user has entered does not meet the validation in terms of our custom validator, then we will have this message displayed, right? So we have a certain last name that is not allowed. And that's what our custom validator is about. Then, of course, if what the user has entered is valid, we have the message validated displayed. Okay. We have the next form control. Label is phone. Input type is tel instead of text. As is a telephone number, we use the same pattern, right? 10 digits. Form control name equal to phone. And then, of course, we check for validity. Right? So if there is an error in terms of the required validation, we have the message, please enter your telephone number. Otherwise, if there's an error in the pattern, then we specify another message or we display another message. Okay. Then we have our success message, meaning if the user has entered something valid, then we display the message validated. Right? I hope you're with me so far. Any questions, any problems, just mention in the comments below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. We then have the next form control, label, input. Here the type is email, form control name is email address or email ADDR, a div to check for validity. Right? Then of course we have the required validation. If that is not met, we have a message, please enter your email address. And then we have a check for if what the user has entered does not meet the email validation. This again is a built-in validation which will check for the format. And then we display the message indicating to the user the format the email address must be in. If the user enters a valid email address, then we have the message validated displayed to the user. Right? Now we start a new form group, that is our nested form group, and the form group name directive can only be used if this group or this form group is a nested one. Okay, otherwise you cannot use this form group name directive. We have a heading and then we have a form control with a break. The label is street. Input type is text, form control name is street. And again, we'll check for validation or validity of what the user is entering. Right? If the required validation is not met, then we have a message, street is required. Okay? If what the user has entered is valid, then we just display the message validated. Next, we have another form control. Note that for street, we just have the required validation. You can add uh, more validators on your form model and then include the necessary div here if you want to have another validation. We have another form control, as I said, with a break. And then we have label city, input type equal to text, form control name equal to city. Okay, and then we have a div, which we will use to check for the validity of what the user has entered. Right? Here again, we're checking for the required validation. If the user leaves it blank, the message will appear saying city is required. Right? If what the user has entered is valid, on the other hand, then we have the message validated. The next thing is another form control, which is for state. So there's a break tag after every form control just to provide some space. Input type equal to text, form control name equal to state. We have a div to check for validity of what the user has entered. Right? We check for whether the user has left the field blank, and then the message status required is displayed. If what the user has entered is valid, then the message validated is displayed. Right? We have another form control. Right? And this one again has a break tag. Label is zip code. Input type is text. Form control name is equal to zip. Then of course we have the validation, or the check for the validity of what the user has entered. Right? If it is blank, then we have a message displayed. And if it does not meet the minimum length validation, then we have another message displayed. Remember that these validations will be mentioned or specified in the form model using validators. Right? That will be in the class file. Why? Because of course this is a reactive form. We have the message validated appear if what the user has entered is valid in terms of zip code. We then have another div, right? And within that we have the select tag. Okay, and again we are using the blur event here. So if the user moves the cursor away from the field, we will have the validate country method execute, sending in the value, right? Which will be the default, of course, right? Because that's what will be, present if the user moves away or the blur event is emitted. Change event as well. When it occurs, we will execute validate country with the value, right? And form control name equal to country. Then we have the option tag, value equal to default, right? That's what will appear on screen. Then we have another option tag where we're using the ng-for directive to loop over the list of countries which we will define in our class file. Of course, using property binding with interpolation, we will have each of those countries displayed in a list, right? Then we have the button, right? Type equal to submit. It will be disabled if the shipping form is invalid or country has error is true. Now, country has error will be a Boolean type property where uh, it will be true if, for example, the user has not selected a country. So basically the value is default, right? So then country has error will be true. And if country has error has the value true, then the for or rather the button will be disabled. This is of course what will appear on the button. And remember, when the user clicks on this button, that's when the ng submit event will be emitted. And when the ng submit event is emitted, the onSubmit method, which we will define in our class file, will be executed. Right, this finishes our view file. The last thing we'll do here is to put in a paragraph just for our reference. We can use now the name we used with the form group directive up here, right, in order to check for the status of the form. Okay, whether it is valid or invalid. That's what this will show. Right, now come to the TypeScript file. Let's start with the TypeScript file and then we'll move on to the styling. So first of all, we need to import customer. Now, the moment you put this in, you'll have a squiggly because we haven't defined that class. So what you do is you will come to your app directory, right click on the app directory, click new file. Okay, enter the name of the file as customer.ts, right? As you can see, I already have that file. Once your file is created, then you need to, there it is, right? So export class customer, put in the constructor and all these properties with their types. You can pause the video at this point to create this class. This would indicate that the instantiation of this class will lead to an object being created. Okay, once that is done, come back to your TypeScript file and you would lose that squiggly. After that, we will import last name validator. Now this is going to be our custom validator. So again, in your, or rather come to your app directory, right click, new file, and you will name it last name dot validator dot ts. Okay, once the file is created, come to the file. Okay, and we'll start by importing abstract control. Abstract control is a class, and it's worth noting here that every form control is an instance of the abstract control class. We need validation errors and we need validator fn, which is a function, right, which will take in abstract control as a parameter and then you know return any errors that may occur. We'll look at that shortly. Once you've done that, next thing we'll do is we'll put an export function last name validator. So this is the name we will use in our form model. Okay, to this function will come a parameter which is going to be a regular expression. Okay, and we'll see that parameter that is being passed when we put in our form model. Then, of course, this function is going to implement the validator fn interface, right, which, as I said, is a function. And then, like I said, it needs a parameter which is of abstract control type, okay, which is basically our form control. And then it will return either a map of errors or it will return null. Okay. Then we'll use the arrow function, and within that we'll specify const forbidden is equal to this pattern, right, will be looked for in the value of the control coming through using the regular expression test method. Okay, so regular expression dot test control dot value, and if this regular expression is found in control dot value, forbidden will be true, otherwise forbidden will have the value false. So forbidden basically will be of Boolean type. Okay, return, now we are using a ternary operator. Evaluate forbidden. If it is true, right, then return forbidden last name with the value, otherwise return null. Now, worth noting that this is the name, right, that we used. We go back to our view file. You see, we used it here. Okay, so come back to your last name validator. Right, so I hope you've understood how we've done this. Again, any questions, you're free to post in the comments. Once we've defined this custom validator, let's now go back to our TypeScript file. Okay, you would now lose that squiggly as well. Next thing we'll do is we'll import form control, form group, and validators from Angular Forms. Remember, this is a reactive form. And again, you may get squigglies under here. Why? Because we need to, in our app module file, so come to the app module file and just import the reactive forms module and then add it to the imports array. Okay. Once you've done that, then this service is not available. We need to create it. So come back to your Node.js command prompt and type in ng generate service shipper. Okay. Once you've done that, the shipper service will be created. Come to it and you'll see something like this. And what we need to put in here is, first of all, inject into the constructor HTTP client, and then that means, of course, that we need to import it, right, with HTTP error response as well to handle any errors that may occur. After that, import customer, right, the class that we created. Then import catch error from RxJS operators as well as throw error from RxJS. Okay. After that, we'll declare a property here. And remember, we did this in the last form as well, right? So we will have a server, a JSON server running in one instance of the Node.js command prompt. And of course, we'll have a file, right, which we'll create later. So just put this in as is, and then, we'll deal with this shipping details later. Once that property is put in, define our method ship to customer, which will be accepting as a parameter details which will, be in customer type or be of customer type, right? And then we say return this.http.post. Again, we're using the post method here. So we are writing to the file at this particular address or URL. And what are we writing? The details that came in as the parameter. Okay. We're using the pipe method to combine two methods of functions, right? And then, of course, we need to define this error handler. Okay. Within the error handler, we are just using throw error. And throw error will do nothing but return an error. Okay. So this completes the service specification or the service file. Let's go back to the class file of the shipping component. Okay, and the next thing we'll do is we will start putting in our form model. So within the ng on init method, put in this.shipping form equal to new form group. And yes, you'll have a squiggly here because we need to declare this property up here, but we'll do that later. First, let's create the model. First name will be a form control, right? Have validators required and validators minimum length 3. Okay. Then we have last name, new form control, and that will have validators required, validators minimum length, and last name validator. And this is the regular expression we are sending. The I means ignore case. Okay, so whether the user enters this in lowercase or uppercase, it will not matter. And we'll go to the validator that we created. Okay. Now, after that, we will have our phone form control, and that too has validators required. And then we have email address, which has validators required, and validators email. This is the built-in email validation that I spoke about earlier. Then we have address as a new form group, right? Note these brackets. Then put in the form controls for this form group. So street, and this will have validators required. City, again will have validators required, right? Then state will have validators required. Zip will have validators required and minimum length. Then we have country, right? And that has validators required. And now we come to our first getter function. These are getter functions. Now, why do we need these? We need these because remember, in our HTML form, or rather our view file, we have used the names first name, last name, right? But how exactly do we refer to each of the Form controls, we would have to refer to them as shipping form dot first name, shipping form dot last name. But since we just want to mention first name and last name, we're going to use getter function. So we say get first name, and then we say return this dot shipping form dot get first name. Okay, which will allow us then to use just first name in the view. Similarly, we'll use another getter function for, or getter method for last name. Okay, and again we're getting that squiggly like I said because we need to define that property. We'll do that later. A getter function for phone, and don't forget to specify as form control or you'll again get compilation errors. Okay, you could do that and then deal with the compilation errors, but you'll know why you're getting the error, right? Get email address, and then get street. Now here we specify address dot street. Okay, note that if we didn't do this in our view file, we would have to say shipping form dot address dot street, and that would make our template look really untidy, right, or very crowded. Therefore, these getter methods or getter functions are very useful. Then we have get city, right, address dot city, that is, and then get state. Okay, and then we have get zip, right, and finally get country. Okay, after this we will now put in public cust model equal to new customer. So now we are instantiating the class we created, and these will have values for each and every property in that class. So the ID, first name, last name, telephone number, email ID, right? Then street, city, state, zip code, country, and instructions, right? Just as we had in this class, right? Okay. Once you've done that, the next thing is to put in public submitted of Boolean type equal to false. You know why we need that property. And then we put in our list of countries. Now you can add to these countries as well if you want. You can remove these countries from here if you like. That's up to you. Then we have the public country has error, which we need for our validation. Right? Of course, we have to still define that method, which we'll do shortly. Public shipping form of any type. And now you will see all the squigglies have gone away. Right? That was just because we had not defined that. After this, validate country. That's the method we'll define. Now, within that, we want to say if val, that's the parameter coming in, equal to default, right? Then country has error would be true. This console.log is just, of course, to see what the value is. Okay, you don't need to put that in necessarily, right? Else, we say this dot country has error equal to false, right? The next thing we do is put in console.log country has error, and of course see the value of country has error, okay, whether it's true or false. Again, this is not necessary. You can choose to ignore it, not have it in your code. The next thing we need to do is to define the onSubmit method, and within this we need to specify this dot submitted equal to true. Why? So that we don't have that form displayed once the data is submitted or once the form is submitted. Console.log, again, this is not necessary if you don't want it. This dot cust model dot first name equal to this dot first name dot value. Now, why are we doing this? In the template driven form, we had the ng model directive, right, that we were using on the template. Here we need to assign to each of these properties the new values that the user is typing in, and so we're doing that within the onSubmit. Okay, so this dot cust model dot first name equal to this dot first name dot value. Okay, and that first name is of course from these getter functions. Okay, and then we have, of course, that's just a console.log. We then have cust model dot last name, cust model dot phone, cust model dot email address, cust model dot street, city, state, zip, country, right? And then instructions. Now here, as you can see, I've hard coded the instructions. It would be nice if you could include an element. I'm sure you can do that on the form, as well as include it in the form model here, right? And include a getter function. Okay. Then have your instructions displayed on screen so the user can type in their instructions, right? Once this is done, we're then going to call the ship to customer method, which remember is in the service, and pass to it the cust model, right, with all the values put in. Now remember, the post method, like the get method, returns an observable, and so we can subscribe to it, right? So dot subscribe, and within that all we are doing is we're just saying take the data that is coming through, right, the parameter that is, and log on the console the message successfully added along with the data that has now been written to the file. And again, if there's an error, then log the console on the log the error on the console. Okay, so this completes our class file. Right, now we've finished with our view file, our class file. You've also seen how to create the class. We created a service, right, in which we're using the post method, and we've also created a custom validator. Now we need to do the styling. So come to your CSS file and just put in these stylings. So there's nothing new here. You're familiar with all these properties. You can just pause the video and copy the styling. Okay. You can see here that we're using the styling classes, right? That is the styling classes that Angular provides. So just put these in as well. Once we are done with the styling, we need to now have this component, that is a shipping component. We need to use a router link somewhere, right? So that we can go to that component. So for that, come to your cart component HTML file first and put in an ng if equal to items added. Remember, we don't want this to be displayed, or rather we don't want the user to fill in the form unless there is something in his or her cart, right? That's why we're doing this if items added or item added to cart. Remember that um, the user can add items to the store component as well as directly from the cart. So we need to take care of both, right? So this we will use with relation to the add quantity function, or rather this one, and then this we will use with relation to the cart. Okay, then put in the anchor tag, class equal to ship link, router link equal to, and that's the path that we specified in the app routing module file. This is of course what will appear on screen. And this is just for our reference, okay, to see whether items added is true or false, right? You can put one for item added to cart as well. You want to, that's just for our reference. Item added cart door component. Okay, and that will be the property item added to cart. Okay. Now come to your cart component TypeScript file and put in here the input property item added to cart, because we're going to use that in the store component HTML as well as in the store component TypeScript file, right? So we're going to share data from store to cart. Therefore, input property for that one. And then we have public items added, right? This, as I said, is for when the user is adding from the cart itself. And for that one, we say this dot items added equal to track order quantity service dot items added, which means that this property has to be also defined in the track order quantity service file, right? So once you've put this in here, so remember we need the input property item added to cart, we need public items added, and then of course we need to inject into the constructor this dependency. Once this is done, we then put in to the track order quantity service file. We specify here public items added boolean equal to false and public item added to cart boolean equal to false. Okay. And then within add quantity, we have item added to cart equal to true. And within update cart add, we have items added equal to true. Within the update cart subtract, when items length goes to 0, we got to specify items added equal to false, right? Now for the styling for that ship link class, we'll come to our cart components CSS file and just put in the styling for that ship link. Text decoration none, background color, maximum width, border, and font. Okay. Now that we've done this, all we need to do is to take care of the shipping details part. Remember the one we used in our shipper service, right? This one. And that, of course, is related to a JSON file. So we need to create that JSON file, but we need to create it within the ecom directory. So right click, new file, type in ship to cust, okay, or ship to customer dot JSON. Okay, once you have that file created, then I will show you how that looks, just like that. Okay, the box brackets to indicate it's an array, and of course the object. Right, now once this is done, the last thing we need to do is to come to our store component HTML file, okay, and we need to specify here item added to cart equal to item added to cart. Remember, we are using one-way data binding or input binding, right? And of course, we need to make sure that this property is also declared in our store component TypeScript file. Okay, so you come to the store component TypeScript file and just put in that property there, boolean type equal to false, right? And once this is done, we can now go and compile. You can use one of the Node.js command prompts or start a new one. Change directory to your project directory, ng-serve. In the other one, we can start the server. So I'm going to stop this and start it again so you can see how to do it. So here we'll just say JSON -server -watch ship to cast dot JSON. Right? Press enter. And once the servers are running, right, you can see here that it is. This is our resource that we used. And once the compilation is done, we can then proceed to run the project. You can see here items added is false and item added to cart is also false. Okay, now if we add to cart, item added to cart becomes true, right? As you can see here, I'll just close this, right? You can see that item added to cart from store is true. And therefore we have enter shipping details. Add another one, right? And now increase, and you will see this changes to true, right? And of course, now we can go ahead to shipping details. The first, let's just keep the console open for later on, right? Because we want to see how our data is written to the file, right? So now you can see the entire form is in yellow. Why is that? That's because in our styling file, if you come to the sorry, if you come to the shipping component styling file, you can see ng untouched is yellow. So currently the form is untouched. Okay, now put in some data. Now if you just move away, you'll get the error message, right? So let's put in some data here. Okay, you get the validated message. Put in some phone number, which should be 10 digits. put in an email, right? Then we have the street, city, state, zip code, right? And finally, country. You can see that the submit button is disabled until the form is valid. Okay, and now we can submit. I'll just keep the console open so that you can see what happens. Rather the Chrome Developer Tools, and let's come to the console. So now when we click on submit, you can see form status there is valid, and you will see successfully added, and ID is 1. Okay, automatically. So the ID increments automatically, okay, as we add more and more data to that file, right? So now if you go and see your JSON file, for example, right, you will see that the file has the data that we entered. Okay. Now what I wanted to do is check all the validations. Remember, we've put in our custom validation as well. Check that, run the project again. If you do find any errors in the validation, right, or the validations are not working, right, try to figure it out yourself. If not, right, you could post in the comments and then I could get back to you in the next session. Right, in the next session, we'll also discuss the payment gateway. So till then, take care, stay safe, bye.